The sun was just beginning to rise over the dusty plains when the train screeched to a halt at a small, weather-worn station. The platform, though modest, was alive with movement, families reuniting, travelers rushing to collect their belongings, and locals selling coffee from tin pots to weary passengers. Among the bustle, a young woman stepped off the train slowly, clutching a small suitcase to her chest. Her name was Clara Whitmore, and this day was supposed to be the most important day of her life. Clara wore a modest, but carefully sewn cream-colored wedding dress. It wasn't extravagant, but every stitch had been done with care. She had spent weeks altering it herself, determined to look as lovely as possible for her fiancé, Thomas Avery, whom she was to marry upon arrival. This was an arranged marriage. Common in her time, Thomas was a ranch owner who needed a wife, and Clara was a woman in need of security and a fresh start. They had exchanged letters for months, and while they hadn't met in person, his words had seemed kind. She had dared to hope for a real future. But Clara carried something else with her besides hope, a deep facial scar stretching from just below her left eye down toward her jaw. A childhood accident with a horse had left her permanently disfigured. Over the years, she had grown accustomed to the stares and whispers that followed her in public. Some saw her scar as tragic, others as frightening, but few ever saw past it. The journey to this town was meant to be her new beginning, a place where maybe, just maybe, she could build a life where her scar wouldn't define her. As the platform slowly emptied, Clara scanned the crowd nervously. Her heart raced each time she saw a man wearing a hat or a vest like the one Thomas had described in his letters. But none of them approached her. One by one, passengers left with their loved ones. A cold breeze drifted through the station, carrying away the dust, and with it, her confidence. She waited for nearly an hour, clutching her suitcase and bouquet tightly, as if holding them would keep her dream from slipping away. But Thomas never came. A station attendant approached her politely, asking if she needed assistance. Clara forced a smile and explained that someone was supposed to meet her. The attendant gave her a sympathetic look, the kind she hated, before walking away. She overheard a few nearby townsfolk whispering, "That must be the bride," followed by soft snickers. The reality began to sink in like a stone. She had been abandoned. Clara sat on a wooden bench as the train behind her gave a final whistle and began to roll away, down the tracks. The sound echoed in the emptying station, amplifying her sense of isolation. She thought of her home, of the life she had left behind, and the shame she would face if she returned. Her family wasn't wealthy, and arranging this marriage had taken great effort and hope. Now she was stranded alone, humiliated and heartbroken. For Clara, this wasn't just a failed wedding arrangement. It was the brutal confirmation of a fear she had carried her entire life, that no one would ever truly want her. Her scar had always been a silent judge, and now it felt like it had rendered its final verdict. Unbeknownst to her, someone had been watching from the edge of the platform. A lone cowboy, leaning against a post, had seen the entire scene unfold. His name was Elias Boone, and like Clara, he carried scars of his own, both visible and hidden. He didn't know her story yet, but something in her quiet strength caught his attention. As the last passengers disappeared into the town and the platform fell silent, Clara remained seated, clutching her suitcase, unsure of what to do next. She had come to this station to begin a new life. Instead, it felt like her life had just fallen apart. While Clara sat on the wooden bench, struggling to hold back tears, she didn't realize she wasn't entirely alone. Standing a short distance away, leaning casually against a weathered post near the water trough, was Elias Boone. He had been at the station since dawn, waiting for a supply delivery that never came on time. He preferred quiet corners, places where no one paid much attention to him. Elias was a man marked by his past. A jagged scar ran from his right temple down across his cheek. the lasting reminder of a gunfight that had almost taken his life years earlier. In a town like this, scars told stories, and his was one people never let him forget. Some called him dangerous, others a cursed man. In truth, Elias had once been a respected ranch hand with a warm heart, but betrayal and violence had left him withdrawn, cautious, and deeply mistrustful of strangers. From his shadowed spot, Elias watched Clara as she searched the thinning crowd with desperate eyes. He noticed the way she stood her back straight despite the clear humiliation settling over her. He noticed her facial scar too, but not with disgust or pity. He saw it as a part of her, not a definition. Perhaps it was because he knew what it was like to be judged by a mark you didn't choose. As the last passengers disappeared into town and the station grew quiet, a sudden dust storm began to roll in from the west. It was fast and fierce, whipping up grit that made travelers scramble for cover. Elias immediately pulled his hat lower and moved toward the small waiting room of the station. Clara, caught off guard, stood frozen for a moment before gathering her belongings and hurrying inside as well. Inside the station, the air was tense but still. The storm outside rattled the windows like a reminder of how exposed and alone they were. Clara sat on a bench, holding her suitcase tightly. Her eyes were red from holding back tears, though she tried to maintain her composure. She wasn't used to kindness from strangers and wasn't sure she wanted anyone's pity. Elias sat across from her, pretending to mind his own business, though his eyes occasionally flicked in her direction. He could tell she was fighting a private battle. A part of him wanted to speak, but years of solitude had made him slow to approach. Still, something about her, perhaps her quiet dignity in the face of heartbreak, pulled at the parts of him he thought were long dead. Eventually, it was Clara who broke the silence. She sighed softly, half to herself, and whispered, "He's not coming." Elias didn't move for a moment. Then, in a low, rough voice shaped by years on the frontier, he said, "Some men ain't worth waiting for." She looked up, startled by his words. Their eyes met for the first time. There was no mockery in his gaze, only an unexpected steadiness. Clara hesitated, but something about his presence felt oddly safe, like a wall she could lean against without it crumbling beneath her. Bit by bit, conversation began to flow between them. Clara admitted, haltingly, that she had traveled for days to meet her fiancé, only to be abandoned upon arrival. She didn't say much about her scar, but Elias understood the pain behind her words without needing an explanation. For his part, Elias shared fragments of his own story. He spoke of a betrayal that had led to a violent shootout years ago, leaving him both scarred and shunned by people he once trusted. "Folks see this," he said, tapping his cheek lightly, "and they figure they know the whole story. But they don't." Clara nodded slowly, recognizing the familiar weight of being misunderstood. For the first time since stepping off that train, she didn't feel completely invisible. The storm outside began to ease, and a warm sunset light filtered through the dusty windows. In that quiet moment, something subtle shifted between them. They were still strangers, but there was a shared understanding that neither of them had expected to find that day. As Clara gathered her belongings to decide her next move, Elias watched her with a mix of curiosity and respect. He didn't know why he cared, but deep down, he sensed that their meeting wasn't by chance. By the time the dust storm finally settled, the sun was dipping low behind the hills, casting the station in a warm orange glow. Clara sat quietly inside the waiting room, her hands folded tightly around her small suitcase. She had nowhere to go, no fiancé to meet, no family waiting, no plan. Her heart felt hollow, yet she forced herself to keep her chin up. She had spent her whole life enduring pitying stares. She refused to break down in front of strangers. Elias remained across from her, his hat tilted forward, his rough hands resting on his knees. For a long while, they both sat in silence, not because they had nothing to say, but but because they were both afraid to let their guard down. Their lives had been shaped by judgment and betrayal, and trust did not come easily to either of them. Finally, Clara let out a shaky laugh, not out of amusement, but disbelief. "I can't believe he didn't even send a note," she murmured bitterly, her voice soft but edged with pain. Elias looked up slowly. "Some men don't have the spine to face what they promised," he said in his low, gravelly voice. Clara met his gaze, searching for sarcasm but finding only sincerity. Something in the way he spoke, blunt yet gentle, encouraged her to speak more openly. "I thought maybe this would be different," she admitted. "People have judged me my whole life because of this." She gestured lightly toward the scar that traced down her cheek. "I thought he might be the one person who would look past it. His letters were kind. He said he didn't care about appearances." She paused, swallowing hard. "But I suppose words are cheap when no one's looking." Her confession hung in the air like a fragile thread. She had never spoken so openly to anyone outside her family. Elias shifted slightly in his seat, his usual guarded expression softening. "I know that feeling," he said finally. "People say one thing when they need you, then turn their backs when things get ugly." For the first time, Clara noticed the scar that ran down his face more clearly in the fading light. It wasn't just a wound. It was a story carved into his skin. "What happened to you?" she asked gently. Elias hesitated. He wasn't used to people asking, not with genuine curiosity, anyway. Most either avoided him entirely or assumed the worst. But Clara's tone wasn't judgmental. It was quiet and kind. "Used to work a ranch," he began. "Had a partner I trusted like a brother. We had a good thing going. Then one day, some men came looking for trouble, money, revenge, doesn't matter now. My partner made a deal behind my back. When the bullets started flying, he left me to take the hit. This scar's from that day." His voice stayed steady, but there was a weight in his words that spoke of betrayal deeper than the wound itself. "I should have died," he added simply. "But I didn't, and ever since then, folks look at me like I'm trouble. Can't say I blame 'em. I keep to myself now. Easier that way." Clara listened intently. She didn't interrupt, didn't offer pity, she simply understood. She knew what it was like to have people write your story for you before they ever heard you speak, for a moment. Their pain met in that quiet station, like two wounded souls recognizing each other in a crowd of strangers. Then something unexpected happened. Elias tilted his head slightly, studying her face. Not the scar, not the sadness, but her eyes. "You know," he said, almost as if talking to himself, "you're beautiful when you're not trying so hard to hide." The words caught Clara completely off guard. She froze, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. No one had ever called her beautiful, not sincerely. "I'm sorry, what?" she stammered, cheeks flushing. Elias shrugged lightly. "I just call things the way I see 'em." For the first time since stepping off that train, Clara's heart fluttered with something other than dread. His words weren't rehearsed or flowery, they were honest. And in that honesty, she felt seen, truly seen, in a way she hadn't thought possible. Outside, the last light of the sunset faded into twilight. Inside the station, something fragile but real had begun to take root between them. Not love. Not yet, but the first spark of trust. The morning after the storm, the town of Red Rock Junction came alive beneath a bright, cloudless sky. Wagons creaked along the main street, vendors opened their stalls, and the usual chorus of gossip and chatter echoed from the boardwalks. Clara stepped off the station platform with a deep breath, clutching her suitcase tightly. She had barely slept. Her mind was still spinning from the heartbreak of the previous day and the unexpected conversation with Elias. She had decided to stay in town temporarily rather than return home in shame. Though she didn't have a clear plan, she knew that going back would mean admitting defeat, not just to her family, but to every cruel whisperer who had ever said she'd never find happiness. She wasn't ready to let them win. Elias walked a few steps behind her, hands tucked into his jacket pockets. He had offered to help her find a boarding house, and though Clara hesitated at first, she accepted. There was something steady about his presence. Unpolished, yes, but genuine. She didn't feel pitied by him, which was a rare and precious thing. But as they walked down the main street together, heads began to turn. The townsfolk noticed. A woman in a prairie bonnet nudged her friend, whispering behind her hand. A group of young men leaning against the saloon railing snickered loudly, one of them muttering, "Looks like Boone found himself a bride no one else wanted." Laughter followed. Clara's cheeks burned. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her pain. She was used to stares, but here, in a town where everyone knew everyone, the scrutiny felt sharper, like walking through a swarm of invisible thorns. Elias noticed the murmurs too. His jaw tightened, and his hand instinctively moved toward the brim of his hat, a habit from years of trying to make himself smaller, less noticeable. But seeing Clara's shoulders tense under the weight of those stares struck a nerve. He wasn't the kind of man to seek trouble anymore, but he wasn't about to let cruelty pass unchecked. At one point, as they passed the general store, a middle-aged man called out mockingly, "Hey, Boone, you trading scars now?" The comment drew a chorus of ugly laughter from a few bystanders. Clara froze for a moment, mortified. Elias turned slowly, his gaze cold and sharp as steel. "You got something useful to say, Tate," he said evenly. "Or are you just flapping your gums 'cause your life's too dull?" The man faltered under Elias's stare. Few people in Red Rock had the courage to provoke him directly. His reputation, scarred face, and quiet intensity gave him a certain intimidating presence. The laughter died down quickly, and the man muttered something under his breath before retreating inside. Elias turned back to Clara. "Don't let him get to you," he said softly. "This town feeds on gossip. Always has. Always will." Clara nodded, though her throat felt tight. She wasn't just fighting the sting of their words. She was also facing a deeper, quieter fear that perhaps these people were right, that she truly didn't belong anywhere. They eventually reached Mrs. Langley's boarding house, a modest building with flower boxes under the windows and the faint smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchen. Mrs. Langley, a practical woman with sharp eyes, looked Clara over from head to toe. Clara braced herself for rejection, but to her surprise, Mrs. Langley simply said, "We've got a room upstairs. Payment weekly. No nonsense under this roof." Clara thanked her, relief flooding through her chest. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a roof over her head and a chance to regain her footing. Meanwhile, rumors about her arrival spread through town like wildfire. People called her the abandoned bride, and some pitied her, while others mocked her misfortune. They whispered about her scar, about Elias's involvement, about the impropriety of them walking together through town. One evening, as Clara sat outside the boarding house watching the sunset, Elias approached. "They'll talk," he said simply, sitting on the porch rail. "They always do. But talk don't change who you are." Clara looked at him thoughtfully. She realized then that Elias wasn't just defending her. He was standing beside her, despite what people said about him too. They were both outsiders in different ways, and somehow that connected them more deeply than either expected. Weeks passed, and Clara slowly began to build a fragile but meaningful life in Red Rock Junction. At first, every day felt like a battle against whispers and stares. But Clara had endured worse in her life, and the humiliation of being abandoned had hardened her resolve rather than broken it. She took a modest job at Mrs. Langley's boarding house, helping in the kitchen and keeping rooms tidy. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it gave her a sense of independence she hadn't felt before. Elias visited often, not in an overbearing way, but with quiet consistency. Sometimes he brought her supplies from town. Other times, they simply sat on the porch and talked while the sun set behind the dusty hills. Their bond deepened not through dramatic declarations, but through shared silences, small acts of kindness, and a growing sense of trust. Clara noticed that, with Elias, she didn't have to hide her scar behind her bonnet or avoid people's eyes. He looked at her as though it wasn't the first thing he saw. And Elias found that, with Clara, he could let his guard down in a way he hadn't since before his betrayal. She never looked at his scar with fear or pity, only understanding. But the town hadn't forgotten about Clara's past. One afternoon, the stillness of life in Red Rock was broken when a familiar figure arrived on horseback. Thomas Avery, Clara's former fiancé. His presence sent a ripple of gossip through the streets. He dismounted at the saloon, trying to look confident, but there was a nervousness in his posture. Word spread quickly, and Clara heard the news while she was sweeping the boarding house porch. Her stomach clenched. Part of her wanted to hide. Another part wanted to confront him. She had spent weeks piecing herself back together. Could she really face the man who had shattered her dignity so cruelly? Elias found her that evening, her hands gripping the porch railing tightly. "You heard," he said simply. "I did," she whispered. "I don't know what I'll do if he tries to talk to me." Elias looked at her steadily. "Then you decide. You don't owe him anything, Clara. Not your silence, not your fear." The next day, Thomas approached her in front of the general store, his expression a mix of guilt and forced charm. "Clara," he began, "I made a mistake. I shouldn't have left. I was overwhelmed." Clara stared at him, amazed at his nerve. He hadn't sent a letter. He hadn't apologized until now that she was making a life without him. "You humiliated me," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "You left me standing there like a fool." Thomas tried to soften his tone. "I can make it right. I have land money. We can still." Before he could finish, Elias appeared, stepping between them with quiet authority. "She doesn't need fixing," he said sharply. "Least of all by a man who runs when things get hard." Thomas glared at him. "This isn't your business, Boone." Elias didn't flinch. "It is now." The confrontation drew the attention of the townsfolk. For the first time, Clara stood her ground publicly, not as a victim, but as a woman who finally knew her worth. "Thomas," she said clearly, "you made your choice the day you left me. I've made mine now. Go home." There was no hesitation in her voice. She wasn't the same fragile bride who had stepped off that train weeks earlier. Thomas left town humiliated, and the gossip that followed was different this time, not cruel, but almost respectful. People began to see Clara not as the abandoned bride, but as a woman of quiet strength. That evening, Elias found Clara sitting on the boarding house steps, staring at the stars. She looked at him with a soft smile. "I think I finally stopped being afraid," she said. He sat beside her, their shoulders brushing. "Fear's tricky," he replied, "but love's stubborn. It finds a way." It wasn't a grand declaration, but it was real. Their bond had grown from pain and resilience, and in that moment, both of them chose love over fear, not as a fairy tale, but as something built slowly, honestly. And together, the weeks following Thomas's departure brought a quiet but noticeable change to Red Rock Junction and to Clara and Elias's lives. The gossip that once clung to Clara like a shadow began to fade. People still talked. Of course, they always did, but the tone had shifted. Instead of cruel whispers, there were curious nods and occasional smiles. Clara's courage during the confrontation with Thomas had earned her a quiet respect. She was no longer just the disfigured bride who'd been abandoned. She was the woman who stood her ground, Clara settled more comfortably into her work at Mrs. Langley's boarding house. She began to decorate the windows with fresh flowers, bake bread with the kitchen staff, and greet travelers with a warm smile. Her presence, once met with judgment, slowly became part of the town's rhythm. She had found her place, not by changing herself, but by refusing to hide anymore. Elias, too, changed in subtle ways. The solitary cowboy who once lingered in shadows now found excuses to spend time in town. He repaired fences for neighbors, helped deliver supplies, and visited Clara often. People still eyed his scar warily, but his loyalty to Clara and quiet strength softened their opinions over time. Their bond deepened naturally. What began as two wounded souls sharing conversations on a stormy night had grown into something solid and unshakable. Elias had become her closest companion, and she had become the first person to truly see him not as a legend or an outcast, but as a man. One late afternoon, under a golden sky, Elias and Clara stood at the very station where their paths had first crossed. It was quiet, save for the distant whistle of an approaching train. Clara looked around thoughtfully. The memory of that awful day when she was abandoned still lingered, but it no longer hurt the same way. The station wasn't just a place of heartbreak anymore. It was where her real story had begun. Elias turned to her, hat in hand, a rare nervousness flickering in his usually calm eyes. "Clara," he began, his voice low but steady, "I ain't got fancy words or promises, but I've been alone a long time, and I reckon I don't want to be anymore. Not if it means you're part of it." For a moment, Clara was speechless. She had imagined love before, but always in distant, idealized ways, in letters, in dreams, in what-ifs. What Elias offered was different. It wasn't polished or grand. It was real. Her smile was soft but sure. "Elias Boone," she said, "I stopped believing in fairy tales a long time ago, but I believe in you." Not long after, the town gathered for a simple wedding ceremony held right there at the station platform. There were no extravagant decorations, no elaborate music, just wildflowers, warm sunlight, and a gathering of townsfolk who, despite their flaws, had come to respect them both. Clara wore a modest dress and carried a bouquet she'd made herself. Elias wore his best jacket and his usual hat. Standing a little straighter than usual. As they exchanged vows, Clara's heart was steady. She wasn't marrying to escape loneliness or to prove her worth to anyone. She was marrying because she had found someone who saw her fully and whom she saw just as clearly. The station that had once been the scene of her deepest humiliation was now the site of her new beginning. When Elias called her beautiful that day weeks ago, it had opened a door inside her. Today, as he took her hands in his, she finally believed it. The train passed in the distance as the ceremony ended, its whistle echoing across the plains like a signal of change. Clara and Elias stood side by side, watching it disappear down the tracks. Neither of them had lived easy lives. Both bore scars visible and invisible. But together, they have built something neither had dared to hope for. A future built on acceptance, courage, and unexpected love. As the sun set, painting the sky in streaks of gold and rose, Clara leaned into Elias's side. She no longer felt like the abandoned bride. She was Clara Boone now, a woman who had found strength in herself and love in the most unlikely place. Their story wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. And that was more beautiful than any fairy tale could ever be.